The American Federation of Labor. As the Knights of Labor faded into memory, another labor organization began to rise. The American Federation of Labor, AFL, was founded in 1886 as an alliance of individual craft unions, organizations of skilled workers in a specific trade, such as carpentry or plumbing. Samuel Gompers, a proud, square-jawed man fond of tall silk hats and good cigars, was the AFL's first president, a post he held until his death in 1924. Born in London to Dutch Jewish parents, he immigrated to the United States at the age of 13. Growing up in New York, Gompers learned the cigar-making trade from his father. Under Gompers' leadership, the AFL grew steadily. Unlike the Knights of Labor, the AFL focused not on all workers, but on skilled, highly paid craft workers, which, at the time, meant that the AFL's membership was mainly composed of white men. Of the 13 founding unions in the AFL, 11 did not admit women. Instead of seeking to transform the American economy, the AFL and its member unions focused on bread-and-butter issues, wages, working conditions, and the length of the workday. Unlike the Knights of Labor, which preferred political action to strikes, the AFL stayed clear of politics and negotiated directly with factory and business owners. When individual businessmen or corporations refused to meet their demands, AFL unions were quick to strike. They sought to use their main strength, their numbers, to great advantage. This practical approach enabled the AFL and its member unions to survive an economic depression in the 1890s. The Homestead Strike. Even as the AFL grew, it suffered its share of setbacks. One of the worst occurred at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steelworks. When Carnegie appointed Henry Clay Frick chairman of his company, Frick set out to smash the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steelworkers, a union associated with the AFL. In June 1892, in response to a cut in wages, steelworkers at Homestead went on strike. Frick proceeded to fire every employee who refused to leave the union and take a pay cut. He replaced the striking workers with non-union workers. He built a 15-foot-high fence around the mill and topped it with barbed wire and searchlights. He hired a private army of 300 detectives from the Pinkerton Detective Agency to protect the replacement workers. On July 6, 1892, as the Pinkerton detectives approached the mill, angry union members were waiting. No one knows who fired the first shot, but a gun battle followed. At least 7 strikers and 3 Pinkerton agents were killed. Pennsylvania's governor sent in 8,000 National Guard troops to put down the uprising and protect the non-union workers. The strike broke the union at Homestead. Frick reopened the factory as a non-union workplace. The remaining workers had their wages cut and their workdays extended from 8 to 12 hours. Eugene, Debs, and the Pullman Strike. In 1894, what began as a railway strike in a small town of Illinois quickly spread and crippled the economy in many states. The town, Pullman, was a community set up and owned by George Mortimer Pullman, whose Pullman Palace Car Company manufactured luxury railroad cars for the major rail lines. In this company town, Pullman did not let his workers buy their residences. They could only rent. Pullman owned the schools, the library, and the post office. He called the workers his children and planted spies to report back to him so he could make sure they were staying in line. When the United States plunged into a deep economic recession in 1893, Pullman laid off more than half of his workers. For those workers who remained, he cut their wages but did not reduce their rents. When a group of his workers protested, he fired them. Pullman's strong-willed ways met their match in Eugene Debs, founder and leader of the new American Railway Union. Born in a working-class immigrant family of 10 children, Debs dropped out of school and started working at the age of 14. His experience on the Terre Haute and Indianapolis Railroad acquainted young Debs with the dangers of industrial life. He later explained, "As a locomotive fireman, I learned of the hardships of the rail in snow, sleet, and hail, of the ceaseless danger that lurks along the iron highway, the uncertainty of employment, scant wages, and altogether trying lot of the workman, so that from my very boyhood I was made to feel the wrongs of labor." Debs' sense of the hardship of railroad life led him to try to unite all railroad workers, skilled and unskilled, into a single massive union. In 1893, he founded the American Railway Union and served as its president. Unlike the American Federation of Labor, the American Railway Union included railroad workers from every skill and pay level. By 1894, Debs was prepared to use his union's growing power to resist George Pullman. The American Railway Union launched a nationwide boycott against the Pullman Company. No member of the union would work on a train that pulled a Pullman car. Within days, 150,000 railroad workers were out on strike. Hundreds of thousands of Americans donned white ribbons to show their solidarity with the strikers. Because Pullman cars were widely used, the nation's railways ground to a halt. What began as a limited boycott had become a national strike. The federal government acted quickly to end the strike. The federal courts declared the strike illegal. Although Debs urged an orderly boycott, some strikers engaged in clashes with deputies hired by the railroads. In July 1894, President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to help end the strike. In Hammond, Indiana, federal and state soldiers fired into a crowd that had swarmed onto the tracks, killing an unknown number of protesters. In Chicago, pro-strike crowds destroyed tracks, turned over boxcars, and burned railroad property. Eventually, 14,000 troops and policemen occupied the city. With the help of federal troops and pro-railroad judges, the strike quickly collapsed. Debs was jailed for contempt of court for ignoring a judicial injunction to end the strike. Debs' attorney, a young man named Clarence Darrow, claimed that the decision left the law so biased that the government could send a man to prison without trial by jury. The Pullman strike weakened the labor union movement and showed again that the federal government was willing to take the side of big businesses. The Cripple Creek miners' strike. Not every labor action ended in failure. The same year that the railroad workers lost the Pullman strike, a group of miners in Colorado managed to achieve their demands. Many of them belonged to the Western Federation of Miners. When mine owners in Cripple Creek, Colorado decided to extend the working day but not raise wages, the miners went on strike. The Cripple Creek strike of 1894 seemed destined for a violent end. Miners passed around rifles and dynamite while the owners hired a private army and prepared for battle. At this point, Colorado Governor Davis H. Waite stepped in. Unlike most state governors, Waite sympathized with organized labor. He met with managers and union representatives and helped the union get an 8-hour workday at a decent wage. He then sent in the militia to keep the peace rather than crush the strike. Alternative visions. The collapse of the Knights of Labor, the disappointing conclusion of the Homestead Battle, and the fall of the American Railway Union were dangerous signals for organized labor. In this climate, some labor leaders were impatient with Samuel Gomper's bread-and-butter unionism for skilled workers, and instead pursued alternative paths to better the lives of all workers. The Socialist Party. One alternative came from the Socialist Party, reformed in 1901. Socialism is an economic and political system that emphasizes government control of productive property such as factories and land, and regulation of the distribution of income. In a socialist system, community ownership is preferred over private ownership, and government control often replaces the free play of market forces. Socialist ideas have been circulating in Europe for decades, but came relatively late to the United States. In America, the Socialist Party included former members of the Knights of Labor and the American Railway Union, as well as many German and Russian Jewish immigrants with European socialist backgrounds. In their view, wealthy factory and business owners kept workers trapped in a life of near poverty. They argued that only by controlling the means of production could ordinary people build a more equitable and just society. In 1911, more than 300 American cities and towns had socialist mayors or other leading officials. Many farmers in the Southwest signed up as members of the Socialist Party. After emerging from prison after the Pullman strike, Eugene Debs became a socialist and the spokesman for the party. He ran for president of the United States several times as a socialist candidate. In 1912, he drew about 900,000 votes, roughly 6% of the national total. Although Debs came in fourth place in the election, his message had an unmistakable appeal. As one journalist begrudgingly put it, "That old man with the burning eyes actually believes that there can be such a thing as the brotherhood of man, and that's not the funniest part of it. As long as he's around, I believe it myself." The Wobblies. In 1905, a group of radical workers met and formed the Industrial Workers of the War, IWW, nicknamed the Wobblies. Unlike the AFL, which focused on organizing skilled workers, the Wobblies argued that the only way to improve the lives of workers was to enroll them all, skilled and unskilled, into one big union. If every worker joined a single organization, then, as one IWW member explained, the workers of the world will have nothing to do but fold their arms and the world will stop. In the Wobblies' worldview, labor and capital were antagonists by definition. One of their founding statements asserted, "The working class and the employing class have nothing in common." The Wobblies were led by a former head of the Western Miners' Union, Big Bill Haywood, a burly socialist who did not shy from the use of guns or explosives. Although they did not stop the world or overturn capitalism, the Wobblies did enroll tens of thousands of unskilled workers in their ranks. They preferred direct action to political action or collective bargaining with employers. They made broad demands and threatened the government and owners of major companies with massive strikes. In 1912, a textile strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts displayed the IWW's strategy. At the time, Lawrence was the foremost textile town in the world. Some 40,000 workers toiled in its mills. Only about 200 of them were members of the American Federation of Labor. After a wage cut and speed up, the workers spontaneously left the mills in protest. They took to the streets chanting, "Better to starve fighting than to starve working." With the help of the IWW, the strikers organized and embarked on a nationwide publicity campaign to show America how poorly they had been treated. One of the Wobblies who came to Lawrence to help the strike, 21-year-old Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, told the workers that the entire wage system needed to be abolished. The strikers sang "The International," an anthem of the International Socialist movement that urged workers to unite and overthrow their capitalist masters. As the Lawrence strike dragged on and food ran low, the strikers decided to send their children out of town and to other families for care. But at the railroad station, police clubbed children and women and sent them scattering. The bad publicity that followed forced the textile owners to give in to the strikers' demands. The Lawrence strike was over. The Wobblies had won, for the moment. In the coming years, the Union fell apart as the nation approached the First World War. Mother Jones. She was born Mary Harris in 1830, but to many American workers, she was known simply as Mother Jones. An Irish immigrant, she moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and married George Jones, an ironworker and union member. In 1867, tragedy struck when her husband and 4 children died in an epidemic of yellow fever. Mary Jones moved to Chicago and worked as a dressmaker. She joined the Knights of Labor. She agitated for safer workplaces, higher wages, shorter workdays, and especially for reforms to child labor laws. Her powerful speeches roused working-class crowds as she urged them to join the Union, boys! She helped the United Mine Workers and was a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World. Even in her 80s, she traveled across the country, organizing workers and confronting managers. When Mother Jones died in 1930, one speaker at her funeral urged people to remember her fiery words, "Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living." Looking backward, Edward Bellamy's utopian vision. In 1888, Edward Bellamy, a journalist and writer, published a utopian novel called Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887. The novel was his way of proposing solutions to the problems of poverty, inequality, and social unrest he saw in the United States. Bellamy imagined the United States in the year 2000. In Bellamy's vision, the violent class conflicts of the 19th century have been left behind. Wealth is evenly and fairly distributed in an economic system in which the industry and commerce of this country ceasing to be conducted by a set of irresponsible corporations and syndicates of private persons at their caprice and for their profit, have been entrusted to a single syndicate representing the people to be conducted in the common interest for the common profit. The main character of Looking Backward, the wealthy young Julian West, seeks a cure for his insomnia. One remedy puts him to sleep for just over 100 years. When he awakes in the year 2000, he is taken in by the family of the kindly Dr. Leet. The novel proceeds mainly through dialogues in which Julian and Dr. Leet look backward on the United States of Julian's time, the late 1800s. Julian comes to see how greatly the nation has changed over the course of a century, while Bellamy, through the voice of Dr. Leet, both advances his critique of social injustice and offers proposals for means to achieve his utopian ends. Literary critics faulted Bellamy's novel as mechanical and stilted, but the book touched a nerve in the American public. In a country rocked by economic depression and violent clashes such as the confrontation at Haymarket, the book offered a fulfillment, even if fictional, of a longed-for vision of cooperation, community, and economic fairness. Looking Backward sold nearly 1 million copies in the United States and Britain in its first 10 years in print. In the United States and in Europe, Bellamy clubs, later called nationalist clubs, formed to discuss and promote the book's ideas. In European countries as well, political groups were influenced by the novel's proposals. Dozens of books were published as unofficial sequels or critical responses to Looking Backward, with titles like Looking Forward or Looking Within. The following excerpt from Looking Backward opens with Dr. Lee speaking to Julian West.
The Bostonians of your day had the reputation of being great askers of questions, and I'm going to show my dissent by asking you one to begin with. What should you name as the most prominent feature of the labor trouble of your day?
Why, the strikes, of course, I replied.
Exactly, but what made the strikes so formidable?
The great labor organizations.
And what was the motive of these great organizations?
The workmen claimed they had to organize to get their rights from the big corporations, I replied.
That is just it, said Dr. Lee. The organization of labor and the strikes were an effect, merely, of the concentration of capital in greater masses than had ever been known before. Before this concentration began, while as yet commerce and industry were conducted by innumerable petty concerns with small capital, instead of a small number of great concerns with vast capital, the individual workman was relatively important and independent in his relations to the employer. But when the era of small concerns with small capital was succeeded by that of the great aggregations of capital, all this was changed. The individual laborer, who had been relatively important to the small employer, was reduced to insignificance and powerlessness over the great corporation, while at the same time the way upward to the grade of employer was closed to him. Self-defense drove him to union with his fellows. The records of the period show that the outcry against the concentration of capital was furious. Men believed that it threatened society with a form of tyranny more important than it ever endured. They believed that the great corporations were preparing for them the yoke of a baser servitude than had ever been imposed on the race, servitude not to men, but to soulless machines, incapable of any motive but insatiable greed. Looking back, we cannot wonder at their desperation, for certainly humanity was never confronted with a fate more sordid and hideous than would have been the era of corporate tyranny which they anticipated.
Labor's gains and losses. By the second decade of the 20th century, the only real success story for organized labor in America was Gomper's American Federation of Labor. By 1904, the AFL had over 1.5 million members in 120 unions, more than the Knights of Labor ever had. Neither the political action of the Socialist Party nor the direct action of the Wobblies overturned the new industrial order. Capital continued to hold the upper hand over labor, in part because industry leaders had powerful allies, including judges who did not hesitate to issue injunctions and throw labor activists in prison, and government officials who sent state militias and federal troops to crush strikes. Still, the battles of labor are evidence that American workers were willing, sometimes at great risk, to make their demands known and their voices heard.